Personally, I love a competition style rib that tugs off that bone, but there's a lot of people that love that fall off the bone rib. So we're gonna make a recipe for that. To season, I'm gonna use my Rock's Anytime rub, and then we're gonna come over to the top with it with some Rock's Summer Barbecue rub. So come on, let's check this one out. For this recipe, I'm using some St. Louis cut spare ribs. When I'm selecting these at the store, I do my best to look for a few things in the packaging. First, I look for as tight of a vacuum seal as possible. The other is I try and look through the plastic packaging and see how much marbling there is in the meat itself. What I'm referring to here is not the white fat that's on top, but the marbling that's intertwined with the red meat. So to get started, I grab some scissors and cut around the plastic as much as I can so that I can remove these ribs from the packaging. Next, I begin with a little trimming. As you can see here, I'm feeling for that bone at the end, which helps me kind of decide where to make my cut to square up this rack as much as possible. This is going to help with a uniform cook and also in presentation if that's something that I'm going for. Spare ribs result in a decent amount of meat and fat during the trimming, but I'm going to save everything, and when I have enough, I remove those bones and I grind it up, making it into sausage. Next, I run my fingers across the bottom, kind of remove any fat, skin, cartilage that's hanging off and covering up the meat. After flipping this rack over, I'm inspecting for any loose items and then trimming anything extra. As for the large chunks of white fat on the top, I'm going to leave most of those as I'm going to be doing a longer smoke, so a lot of that will render down itself, but I do want to trim it a little bit just to clean up the overall appearance. The last trimming I did was trimming off a little extra edge on that far side to get the rack straightened up as best as I could. Overall, I was pretty happy with this rib trim, and after one final inspection and a few other quick trims, I'm calling this one good. The last thing I do before seasoning up these ribs is to remove the membrane. As you'll see, this one gives me a little bit of trouble, but I left it in this video instead of editing that part out because I wanted to show that sometimes they don't come off as easy as you'd like. But if you just continue to work at it and then grab a paper towel once you get a finger underneath it, you'll be able to rip that membrane off fairly quickly. Just make sure you remove as much of that membrane as possible, as this will allow smoke to get through. It also allows the seasoning to adhere best, and just overall, it's going to have a better taste, a better bite, and a better presentation at the end. So unfortunately, this one didn't come off in one tear, so I just grabbed the end of that remaining membrane, just went ahead and ripped it right off. Now I'm ready for my seasoning, but first I want to apply a binder. This is certainly an optional step, but it's one that I use quite often. As you can see here, I'm just going to use some simple yellow mustard. The first question I always get asked, does this change the taste? No, it really doesn't. I basically just splattered this on and use my hand to work it in. Applying this binder is going to help the rub stick in that early smoking process. With the binder applied, I start with a layer of my Rock's Anytime seasoning, which is a great all-purpose rub. It brings in heavy salt, pepper, garlic flavors, but if you don't have it handy, a pretty comparable rub that I like to use is the AP from Killer Hogs. With the base layer applied, next I use some of my Rock's Summer Barbecue rub, which is a traditional barbecue rub with some added molasses to bring in those smoky flavors. But if you don't have that handy, another one from Killer Hogs that I like to use is called the barbecue rub. Here again, I'm just applying a nice even coat to get the entire side coated. And after applying both rubs, I lightly pat it in, but don't rub it in. That's right, a common misnomer about seasonings in barbecue is that you rub them in. However, you want to lightly pat them in or just leave them alone altogether, because a light pat will keep the rub from clumping up, while also it'll make it adhere and stick to the binder that I've placed on. With the bottom side ready, I flip these ribs over to get started on prepping the top side. The reason I started with the bottom side first is that I'm going to be smoking these meat side up, and whichever side is going to be up is the side that I'm going to season last. Again, to get started, I grabbed some yellow mustard and applied a nice even coat across the entire top of this meat side of the rib. With the binder applied, I once again grabbed some Anytime seasoning to apply my first coat across the entire top side of these ribs. After applying the Anytime, I then grabbed the Summer Barbecue, just like I did on the bottom, and hit it with a final even coat across the entire top side. But as I kind of said before, selecting rubs is a great area to experiment with and create different flavor profiles. But it certainly doesn't stop there. Later in this recipe, I grabbed some of my Rock's Irish Whiskey barbecue sauce to finish these ribs off, and that's another great area to insert some fun flavor combinations. Now, just before putting this rack of ribs on the smoker, I use a trick that I learned from Pitmaster Heath Riles. Holding onto my ribs at both ends, I used all that overcast from the seasoning to get the rubs to stick to the sides and the ends of the ribs. And that's it. These suckers are ready for a few hours in the smoke bath. But I give them one more visual inspection while patting in that rub on the top side. At the very end, I couldn't help myself, I played a quick drum fill on them. For this recipe, I'm running them on my Traeger Ironwood 885 at 275 degrees for the entirety. This will allow some solid smoke flavor, but also keep the cook within a reasonable time. With my smoker at temp, I go ahead and place this rack of ribs in the center of the grate and then close the lid before smoking them for about 2 hours unwrapped until the meat hits an internal temp of 175. During the first 2 hours, I go ahead and spray them with a mixture of apple cider vinegar and water, a total of 2 times. Now after that first 2 hours, I'm ready to pull them off and wrap, so I rip off a good chunk of butcher paper. As you can see, this was a windy day and it was kind of making me mad, but I put that spray bottle down before spraying it with some apple cider vinegar water mix to make that butcher paper a little more pliable and easy to use. With the butcher paper prepped, I move the ribs from the smoker, but not before a quick bend test to see how they're coming along. And I must say, these things are coming along fantastically. After placing the ribs near the front of the butcher paper, I fold it over and then work at maneuvering that butcher paper and folding all the edges in to wrap these ribs nice and tight. For this step, you can certainly grab some aluminum foil, but I found for this recipe, it can almost make them a little bit too tender when cooking for this long. So now that I've got them all wrapped up and good to go, I tucked in that last portion under, and then I throw them back on the smoker, still running at 275 degrees for another 2.5 hours. At this point, I'm a total of 5.5 hours in, so I unwrap the ribs to check and see if the bones are beginning to pull away, and that's how I know they're done. But just to be safe, I did hit them with an instant read probe, looking for a temperature around 205 degrees. Given that's where I was at, I went ahead and unwrapped these from the butcher paper and then applied a layer of my Rock's Irish Whiskey barbecue sauce. Once I had that applied, I used a basting brush to evenly spread the barbecue sauce across the ribs. Again, this is a great opportunity to grab any barbecue sauce that you really like and use that here. But if you're looking for one that I do like, again staying with Killer Hogs, they have a great sweet barbecue sauce that would work really well with this recipe. Now that I've got these ribs totally sauced, I'm in good shape, and I'm ready to go ahead and put these back on the smoker for maybe about another 10 to 15 minutes. This is going to allow that sauce that I just placed on to really warm up and also tack up a little bit in what we call setting the sauce. Given that these ribs are very tender at this point, I do want to be really careful when I'm moving these off the butcher paper and back onto the smoker so I don't break them apart. So in total, I've cooked these for about 5 hours and 45 minutes. That's where I was able to get to my desired doneness, and as you can see, with just a little bit of pressure, I'm able to pull out the bone entirely from this rack of ribs, making it truly a fall off the bone rib. To serve these up, I pull out my Messermeister Kendrick barbecue knife and I cut these ribs in between each bone, first starting where I pulled that rib bone out. Now my favorite part is getting in for that first bite, and I gotta tell you, these things were absolutely delicious. They were completely tender, but had just the right amount of texture to be not too firm and not mushy at all. This recipe is an absolute winner. If you've made it this far, I can't thank you enough for watching this entire video. So please hit that like and subscribe button so I can keep creating great content like this.